Good afternoon, everybody. From Chef 0.6 to Chef 11, Engine Yard steps into a time machine. Thanks. I'm Ryan Souza. I'm from beautiful, sunny Portland, Oregon. I work for Engine Yard at our Portland office up there. What is Engine Yard? Quick plug. We started as a Rails web app PaaS on top of AWS, and in the last 2 or 3 years, we've expanded into Azure, Terramark. We went from being just MySQL to having Postgres, React, MongoDB, Redis, all sorts of things. So quickly, what is a PaaS to us? So basically, we are a layer that sits between you and the infrastructure, whether that be AWS, who knows what it'll be in the future. So we're really about managing the infrastructure with our tools. So more specifically, I work with our chef, which probably makes sense considering I'm presenting here. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the past of Engine Yard and some of the issues that we had and what we're doing today to sort of try and come back from some mistakes that were made. So I'll start with the past. 2009, long before I was working at Engine Yard, Chef was just getting started. Engine Yard decided to jump in on this bleeding edge technology, and really jump in with it, even though the community was still pretty young, still kind of figuring out what this brand new tool was really going to do. Unfortunately, Engine Yard grew really fast. It was like wildly successful. And because of this and all the features and work that were being done on our Chef stack, we just couldn't keep up with the community that was really beginning to figure out how the tool was going to fit in. And so we ended up with kind of a pile of anti-patterns. At the time, they didn't quite look to be that bad, but history has definitely shown that that was the case. So we ended up with a lot of highly coupled cookbooks. They were organized maybe a little bit more by the nouns or where, organized a little bit more by the nouns than necessarily into sort of small components that would live together. And this was really frustrating because you would get assigned a bug and figure, you could take this down in an afternoon. You'd submit your fix, and then things would break in all sorts of other places that had nothing to do with the code that you were actually touching. So this was very, very frustrating. All of the cookbooks lived in a single repo, which is sort of how most Chef distributions were managed back then. So it was very easy to hop between cookbooks and spread your logic all over the place without any sort of reason not to back then. So really, because of this, our cookbooks began to stagnate. Engineers would begin, so as old engineers left and new engineers would enter the company, the same sort of patterns would be copy and pasted and basically taught to the next generation. We ended up having just a large amount of code that was written in ways that was very specific to Ruby 1.8.6 and very specific to Chef 0.6, which meant that there was going to be sort of a large amount of time needed to go back into this code and sort of clean it up in order to bring it to the future. And this was never really followed through with. And so we ended up with what we're calling Engine Yard Chef, which was Chef 0.6 from 2009, still being actively developed and exposed to customers in 2011, 2012, 2013. It was really an unfortunate state of affairs that there was so much code that we just felt that we couldn't fix the whole thing. And this was really terrible because not only could us as developers not make use of any of the tools and learnings that the community had really gained over the 4 or 5 years since, but our customers couldn't as well. A big part of the product was the ability to upload your own custom cookbooks, and it was basically in a situation where we would have to explain to customers how to use our version of Chef because all of the documentation on the internet contained ways that were just not available on our platform. There were likely many causes or many factors that kind of led to this situation. It's my opinion that the testing situation was one of the biggest ones. The testing setup that we had really wanted to be end-to-end. It was using real AWS instances, real full Chef runs. You were waiting for packages to be uninstalled, installed. It felt very real, but all of the data that was running on was very fake. This was interacting solely with the instances in Chef and had absolutely no interaction with the orchestration layer above it. And so while they felt slow and they felt useful like end-to-end tests do, we were finding that they were not actually catching bugs that were found on production. And so we began to think, these tests are slow, these tests are flaky, they're not really catching any of the issues we're having. What are we going to do? And unfortunately, the answer was just to start testing manually. Using the same UI that our customers did, you would spend an hour on a bug fix and then spend the afternoon running through your checklist, making sure you didn't break anything that customers were using. This was very unfortunate. This is sort of the antithesis of DevOps, which is all about repeatability, automation. It was not a good state of affairs. Eventually, about a year ago, we just decided that the automated tests had no purpose, and we just turned them off, and we were stuck. So, quick recap. Some of the anti-patterns we fell victim to. We let our environment get out of date. We couldn't use any of the knowledge that other people in the community were getting. We had to do everything ourselves because we were so far from everyone else. Our cookbooks were way too tightly coupled. Even if we wanted to rewrite our tests to do very specific pieces of functionality, you would still end up really testing large portions of the cookbooks, which would still be very slow and, again, not real end-to-end testing. And finally, you shouldn't be testing things manually. If you do, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to spend afternoons on it, and in general, it's just not going to be a great experience for you as a developer. So we'll fast forward a little bit and talk about, well, not quite yet. So about a year ago, some of the other teams were gearing up with some new work. We had a new multi-cloud provisioner. We were jumping in with Azure, looking to increase ties with Terramark. We had a new JavaScript UI in the wings that was going to make it much easier for front-end UX people to really dial in the experience without requiring massive amounts of updating tests in one giant Rails application. And to run this, we had a full service API that we were writing that will become public and has really the same amount of power or it offers the same amount of power to everyone that we have as developers. And so we were faced with the decision, would we take these cookbooks that had caused so much pain for us and just knuckle down and try and port them to Chef 10? I'm sure we could have thrown together some amazing regular expressions to have done 90% of the work. But we didn't think that was quite enough. We really wanted to do it the right way. This was around ChefConf last year, actually, where we had really been exposed to all of the amazing new things that the community had began to really get into and do while sort of Engine Yard had looked away from it. And we were very impressed, and we wanted to do that too. So what we learned was you really need to stick with the community, learn from the community. Sometimes going off on your own can lead interesting things, but if you can't bring that back to the community, or if you don't want to, you're probably not really doing anything interesting. We learned that we really needed to make our cookbooks focused so that we could really test them by themselves and not as some large bundle of yarn. And that really, you needed to feel good about your tests. If at the end of the day, you don't feel like you can push code, even though you have a green build, then all of that time spent testing is probably not actually worth it. So now I'm going to fast forward to the now and talk a little bit about what we're doing at the moment. We've jumped in with the community cookbooks in a big way. They provide a really solid foundation to build your product on. Even if you're not using all of the features that they provide, you're not reinventing code. You are getting the benefit of those tiny little bug fixes that I'm sure that you would make by yourself. And it's really easy to follow the cookbook wrapping pattern that is quite popular. And really it gave us the chance to begin integrating with the community again. I say that it's a solid foundation, but it's not strictly that. The community cookbooks will change over time. And this is good because they are changing with the community. If you are just forking them and continuing with the code that you have, you will be distancing yourself from what the community thinks is a best practice. So by integrating this as a core of our product, we sort of make it easier to keep up with the community. Because if we don't, we'll be making a lot more work for ourselves in trying to fork and backport issues or fixes and all of that. So pattern number 1, check. Doing good. Now I want to talk about some of the tools that we use. Hopefully none of these names are unfamiliar to anybody. Vagrant is amazing. We've been using Vagrant in different ways for 3, 4, maybe even, I don't know, from the start probably. I think there was a year or two that we supported it. We supported it for quite a bit. It makes it super easy to develop your cookbooks locally. But it's not just for Chef. There are definitely times on my Mac where I spin up a Vagrant box because I need to just poke around in Linux and try and solve a problem. Unfortunately, the laptops of today are many magnitudes faster than sort of the entry level of the cloud, and we have definitely had 3 or 4 race conditions essentially in our code that were not actually found until we booted them on real boxes, and some that were not found until we booted them on real boxes that had bad network connectivity. So, Shelf, pretty simple. One cookbook per repo. Helps make it easy to write cookbooks, or to write many cookbooks with single responsibilities. Making it easier to do the right thing is always going to be better than trying to make it harder to do the wrong thing. It also makes it really easy to jump in with the community cookbooks, which, like I've said, is a huge part of working with Chef. Number 2, check. Unfortunately, Shelf 2 had some issues. A couple months into the release of our new product, we found that the versions that we had locked to locally were not actually being put on customer instances, and this was very frustrating. It turns out there were some dependency resolution issues, and it ended up forcing us to move away from the normal specifying your versions to a major minor in a semantic way, to actually specifying the exact version of each cookbook, which added some more work to our workflow, but it sounds like 3.0 has fixed all of these problems and is amazing, and we are already in process switching to that. And well, not quite finally, Test Kitchen. Test Kitchen made us very happy. It made it amazingly quick and easy to write real tests. We were testing things like our Nginx configs were totally legit. Our unicorns were serving traffic. It was a breath of fresh air from the old testing setup. Again, it makes it super easy to do the right thing, to write nice focused components. And it's really about testing your cookbook's API, your attributes, your resources, your recipes. The rest of the company is it's very important to us in Engine Yard to have it continuous integration. Nothing that gets in front of customers, no tools that you expect other people to use. Nothing like that happens unless it's submitting green builds to our CI server. We use Travis in a lot of other places. It was super easy to use Kitchen EC2 and some encrypted credentials to bring Test Kitchen into an automated CI setup. Unfortunately, we end up with a busy and waiting Travis worker, but that's a small price to pay to know that your master branch is actually green, and that when you want to spend an hour fixing a bug, you're not going to spend a day fixing unrelated things. But you do need to be careful. Test Kitchen is still fake data. It's impossible to test all of the inputs. Everyone knows that. And it should probably not even be considered integration testing. Even if you could test that Nginx and your app server are communicating, you're not testing that your load balancing layer is actually communicating to them. It's not an end-to-end test. We unfortunately attempted to use it sort of like that, and have been stuck with sort of the same thing that we were originally, slow, flaky, not very useful setup. So heed those words. Yeah. So we really needed more than just Test Kitchen, which is where a tool named Dread comes in. Dread uses our fancy new API to really pretend to be a customer. These are as real of end-to-end tests as you are going to get. Dread spins up full clusters, full environments. Dread kills servers. Dread adds new servers. Dread makes sure that your MySQL replicas are actually replicating data and that your app that uses read slaves can actually see that data. These are real-life scenarios. They give us confidence that our code is actually correct. And it gives us assurance that we're not going to get paged in the middle of the night for stupid bugs that shouldn't have been there to begin with. So that's the most important thing that I hope that you take away from this talk is good testing is the most important thing when it comes to development. So I briefly want to talk about our workflow a little bit. We are heavily invested in GitHub and pull requests. It makes it really easy to be agile with your development process. Travis CI gives you nice green statuses when your code is right, gives you big fat reds if you made a mistake. We have ended up with a single Burk file in a repository that sort of tracks the exact versions that are being deployed to actual instances over time. As I'm sure you can see, everything is actually pinned to specific versions. Hopefully that'll go away, and we can really begin to rely again on the semantic versioning of the community and, in the ideal case, our own cookbooks as well. Until then, we sort of had to write a tool that would tell us when we were doing things wrong, when we had versions that needed updating, commits that needed releasing. At the end of the day, though, Dread still shows up before we release anything to customer instances, and to date has caught many, many dumb as well as very, very peculiar bugs. And that's saved us from, I can't even imagine how much headache with actual customers. So, final recap, stick with the community, learn with the community. Even if you disagree sometimes, don't run away. Stick with it. Keep your cookbooks small. Keep them focused. And make sure you like your tests. Coming up for Engine Yard, we're looking for ways to give back. For the last year, we've really been sprinting into getting our new product out on its legs. We've had a couple fixes and features get merged back upstream, and we've got a couple more waiting in the wings for some free time. Hopefully, as we start adding new features to our platform, we can start releasing our cookbooks as well to really give back in the community in the same way that we are supported by them. So thanks. That's my talk. And now do your worst. Questions?
Hi, I'm Dimitri from admins.com, and I'm not too experienced with Chef, and I was looking at your environment definition file, if you can go back to that. And I was just curious about
This one?
Yeah, the second block and the third block. I see that you're specifying GitHub in the second block, and also like a cluster cookbook. And could you talk about that?
Sure. So these are all of the cookbooks that come from Chef's community site, just using the plain Burke Shelf API. The second block here are cookbooks that we have essentially forked in GitHub to apply some fix or small tweak that we needed to happen really inside of the cookbook that we couldn't replicate by wrapping it with the second cookbook. And so all of those are temporary, which is why it's very small. In an ideal world, it would not exist at all. And so those are either going to get pull requested back to the actual cookbooks that they came from, or in the worst case scenario, actually become a separate fork. But that's not hopefully going to happen. And then finally, all of these EY underscore prefixed ones are actually our cookbooks. Lots of them have similar names to community cookbooks, and those would be the wrappers. Some others, like clusters, base, app, those are really where we tie together all of the community cookbooks in sort of an orchestration manner, and that's sort of the most important bits that we write.
The custom syntax, is it actually being used by Chef Client? Like, say, Chef Client would pull, the GitHub repo, or
Right.
it knows that cluster cookbook is something special, or is it like just for your own information kind of thing?
So because a Burks file is just Ruby trademark, the cluster cookbook is basically just a little helper function that just says, basically there's some unsaid things here, which is there's the GitHub entry that says this cookbook comes from our organization and it's named this. It was really just to cut down with the amount of copy-pasted sort of arguments to the cookbook function. I believe in our Burke Shelf 3 setup, we're actually working on getting a Burke Shelf API server pointed at our GitHub repos in a way that we won't have to use the Git protocol at all. We will just be able to name them all just like cookbook, and they'll just come from our server first.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah. Did you port any pre-existing services from Chef 0 to Chef 11, or were they all, I guess, new rights of new services? And if so, do you have any gotchas for that, like making the actual transition to a new Chef server while keeping the service up?
No, we did not actually end up porting any of the old code, as far as I know. Maybe some small helper functions. The old code was all written really before there even were community cookbooks. So it was pretty basic stuff, your MySQL, your app server, your Nginx. So really, if we had ported any, we would have been doing that instead of using a community cookbook, which is really what we didn't want to be doing. Definitely some small logic fixes have made its way back to the old cookbooks, especially when it comes to setting various configs on database servers and stuff like that. But as far as I know, no any amounts of code have really made it the other direction, which definitely was easier on us, but. Another question?
Yeah, actually, so the original Chef setup at Engine Yard, we had running on our bare metal so the 0.6 was, Chef Solo.
Right.
And allowed customers to upload their own cookbooks.
Right.
And have their own custom setup essentially. So close to 1,000, VMs running custom stuff. So, how are you dealing with that it wasn't actually Chef, it was Chef Solo being run in a custom way.
Right.
Just getting rid of all that and going with the regular Chef way.
So we are still using Chef Solo. It is sort of an interesting setup. when we first started writing the new cookbooks, we were still heavily using the community cookbooks in the way that they are like meant to be used through attributes, through their resources, but not very many of the community cookbooks that sort of orchestrate on top of that and expect to be running in a chef server setup. And that's where some of our cookbooks sort of swapped in to provide that functionality while communicating with, the orchestration that we have, and not an actual chef server. So I don't know if that will be the case forever, but we definitely are still using Chef Solo. We're working on providing more of a sort of normal feeling set of attributes coming down from our server and less sort of engine yard feeling attributes. So who knows what it'll be after that, but that's what we're working on right now. Any other questions? All right, I'll call that good. Thanks, everybody.